Hey all, welcome back to MEC Live. This edition is going to be on the subject of propane. Today, we will be talking with David Albrecht, who is the Kansas City Clean Cities co-coordinator, along with me, your host, Brant Hertenstein. This one's going to be a little bit different. Tammy is not here today, unfortunately. What we're going to do instead is David is our resident expert on propane. He knows far more than I do, and so this is going to be more of a question and answer session. We hope to get all of your questions on propane answered. We have a list of questions for David to go through, and if there's any additional questions, please leave them in the comment section, and we will address them as we can. David, let's talk about propane. Do you want to
Cool.
introduce yourself at all?
Yeah, well, I think you did about as good a job as I could do. So let's get into the propanity of it all.
There we go. There we go. All right, propane. What is it?
Well, propane is one of what is known as the natural gas liquids. You probably know and use some of them, and some of the others are probably going to be all Greek. If you've got a grill lighter or a cigarette lighter, you're using butane. Propane's fairly familiar. Things like pentane, which is part of gasoline, ethane, which is a building block for plastics. But it's a fairly common fuel used in a lot of different applications, not just for vehicles.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so when we think about fuel, most of the time I would say our consumers are thinking about liquid fuel.
Mhm.
That's easy. We know where it comes from. It comes from oil, it comes from oil. Where does propane come from?
Okay, propane in nature is found in oil and gas formations. So when you get a drilling rig and you drill into that reservoir of oil or gas, or very often both because they associate with one another, natural gas liquids, including propane, are part of the stream of crude oil and condensate and gas that comes out of that natural reservoir. Uh, Sometimes they are separated at the wellhead. That's a little unusual. Usually, natural gas liquids like propane, ethane, pentane, what have you, are going to be separated during the refining process that breaks down crude oil into the heavy stuff like tar and the really lightweight stuff like kerosene. And then when that is accomplished, then propane will be pulled out of the stream, the refining stream. It will then be compressed and shipped in tanker cars. You've seen them at railroad crossings at some point in the past. And then it can be shipped pretty much anywhere by train or by truck. Um, Natural gas liquids, you think of propane as a gas, but its physical properties are very convenient. If you compress it, it turns into a liquid. And then you just pump that gas into whatever container you're using. It liquefies and you ship it in gallons, much as you would ship gasoline or diesel fuel.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so now that you've given where does it come from, let's talk more about application. You had aforementioned said that propane, we all know propane from firing up a gas grill. You
Mhm.
can exchange those propane tanks out at like your local fueling stations. What other applications of propane are there?
There's a lot of stuff. Unless you're a charcoal guy, you have probably encountered it during the summer grilling season. And as you mentioned, you can get a bottle of propane for whatever purpose at Lowe's or Home Depot or co-op stations, places like that. But it's used for a lot of different things. It can be used for refrigeration. So particularly in areas, say you have a cabin in the woods, you're going to have a propane tank there that is connected to your refrigerator. So it provides cooling as well as heat. You can run industrial and farm equipment off it. It's often used for drying corn. We are part of the Corn Belt and we produce a lot of it. But the corn that comes out of the field isn't ready until it has been dried, and that drying is accomplished with the use of propane. Um, it's not as common as it could be in vehicles. It's not used that often for fuel, even though it's got its advantages. But a very popular application for it is also in lawn equipment. If you drive by a golf course or a park, you're probably going to see somebody running one of those really, really big decked mowers, the things that cut like 5 feet across.
Yep.
Those were commonly diesel 15, 20, 25 years ago. Even worse, a lot of them were two-stroke diesel, so they were really, really dirty. And if you're taking your kids to the park, the last thing you probably want them to be breathing is diesel fumes. So, propane is a really good substitute for that, and you can power a variety of industrial equipment with it. It's also getting a fair amount of use in school bus fleets. Again, getting back to the issue of diesel emissions for school administrators, teachers, certainly for parents. You'd like to, if at all possible, avoid having your kids breathing diesel exhaust, which is a known carcinogen, which is not good for you. And propane is way cleaner than diesel. So a school bus fleet is a really good application for it.
That is all very interesting stuff. And yes, of course, we don't want our kids or really anybody breathing in diesel emissions. That's kind of our whole point of this is
Yep.
to find alternative fuels that don't produce the same emissions as diesel and petroleum.
Hmm.
Yep. So let's go back to transportation. Can you give some general statistics on propane and transportation? We know about diesel, we know about petroleum. Those are probably the two of the most well-known and well-used fuels in our arsenal. But what does propane have?
Well, as you mentioned, the world runs on diesel and gasoline, particularly diesel if you're talking about shipping lots of stuff long distances. Propane is number three. So in certain areas, you're going to find it heavily used. If you, for example, go to Japan and you hop in a taxi, it's about 100% certain that the taxis in that fleet are going to be powered by propane.
Wow.
Yeah, in Tokyo, if you go back 40, 50, 60 years, Japan had terrible air quality. So this was an obvious choice for them to use in vehicles that run pretty much all the time. Um, the handy thing about propane, even though people don't think about it all that much, is that it has a strong existing fueling network. It's easy to find, it's easy to buy, it's easy to get your hands on. Fueling stations are all over the place. And again, when I'm talking about fueling stations, I don't mean places where you go to swap out your bottle when the grill runs cold. I'm talking about places where you can actually fuel a vehicle with propane. You can find those, by the way, a little bit of a digression here. If you're looking for a place where you can fuel a vehicle with propane, you want to go to the Department of Energy's website, and that's afdc.energy.gov. It's a really cool website. Just select your alternative fuel. It could be propane, it could be biodiesel, whatever it might be. Select that on the map and then zoom in where you are or where you're going, and you will find out where you need to go and how you can get it. Um, it's also got some advantages over uh, conventionally fueled vehicles, that is diesel and gasoline. It's the least flammable of all alternative fuels. And if you are talking about a propane tank versus a conventional fuel tank in a truck or a car or what have you, propane tanks are about 20 times more puncture resistant than the gas tank you're going to find on a passenger car or pickup truck. So in that sense, it's definitely got a little bit of an edge in safety.
Interesting. So I want to go back to the fueling stations. You said that they're widely available. How would you compare propane stations to, let's say, biodiesel stations or CNG stations around the world? Is there more or not around the world? I should say around or the United States. Are there more or less? And then do you know how many public stations there are in the United States approximately?
Oh, I'm not really sure about that. I want to say it's maybe 2,500, give or take. It's a little bit different. It's not that you just pull up and pull out put the nozzle in the tank and squeeze the trigger to fuel up. when you're using propane, you are depressurizing a chilled liquid. Propane's really, really cold. When you release the pressure, it comes out of the tank into the fueling system and then into the vehicle. But a little bit different than a diesel or a gasoline nozzle. Uh, we can probably get into a little bit more detail uh, on that when we're talking about fleet applications. But in many cases, propane station, if you are fueling a truck or a car with it, they'll have somebody there who does the fueling for you. You have to be a little bit more careful with it than you do with diesel or gasoline.
Gotcha. So I was gonna that led right into my next question, which was you've talked about all the benefits of propane, but why hasn't it caught on more in the United States? Do you say it's a little bit more volatile in terms of it's able to be distributed by the average consumer?
Yeah, it's less volatile. Its access is not difficult by any stretch. There are a couple of reasons. Like I said, fueling is a bit more complicated than it is with gasoline or diesel. It's also not as energy dense a fuel. Different alternative fuels and conventional fuels, you get different bang for the buck for each of those. There are X number of BTUs, British thermal units. Sorry, I'm pulling out the high school physics textbook here. There are different amounts of BTUs in a cubic centimeter of gasoline compared to diesel, compared to propane, compared to natural gas. And propane isn't as dense. It's about 3/4 as energetic as gasoline.
And
So
I just wanted to clarify BTUs per cubic centimeter, that is just a unit of energy.
yeah, it's a measure of how much energy a fuel contains. How much work can that amount of fuel do? So yeah, this is just the standard measurement for how much work you can get out of a given volume of fuel. So like I said, propane is only about 3/4 as energetic as gasoline. Gasoline itself, we're all used to it, but it's about 10% less energetic than diesel fuel. So if the only consideration is bang for the buck, miles to the gallon, you may be looking at diesel over gasoline or propane, but there's more to it than that. Uh, Fueling, okay, I'll just dive into it. This is changing. It used to be if you were fueling vehicles with propane or having a propane supplier come to a fleet location, and a lot of propane, it tends to be used more in fleets than it does in individual passenger cars or trucks. You'd have to have somebody come out with a what's called a bobtail truck. It's basically a class 6 or 7 truck with a big tank on board. That tank has the propane in it.
Gotcha.
And then the driver would jump out and would go around to the different vehicles and pulling the truck down the line of trucks or buses or whatever he's fueling, and then connect the fastener and fuel up each vehicle and work their way on down the line. Um, like I said, propane in liquid form is at about 40 below zero. It's not like a true cryogenic liquid like liquefied natural gas, which is about 260 degrees below zero. With LNG, if you're fueling, you have to use all kinds of very heavy duty safety equipment, visors and boots and special protective clothing. You have a little bit of that with propane, typically a visor and heavy duty gloves, but it has a little bit of a risk to it that, like I said, gasoline and diesel don't have. It's a little more complicated. What has changed and what's made it a lot easier to work with in the last couple of years is the development of a new kind of fueling nozzle. So you don't have this big bulky thing that you have to screw on to the fueling port in the truck or the bus that you want to fill up with propane. Instead, it's something that's pretty close to a gas fueling nozzle. It simply locks into place on the fueling port, and then you operate it just like you would uh, a diesel pump or a gasoline pump. You just squeeze the trigger until you've got the fuel that you need, and then you disconnect it and put it back on the rack, and off you go. So that little complication, which may have been kind of off-putting for some fleets or vehicle owners, that's a lot less of an issue than it used to be. But yeah, on top of that, if you are looking at propane as a fuel, you need to modify your vehicle, and that can cost, depending on what you're driving, whether it's a truck or a bus or a car, that can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $9,000. That's kind of a ballpark figure. It's an aftermarket modification. You have to do it in order to run on propane, and so that cost for some people is off-putting. Why do that when you can just run a conventional diesel or gasoline vehicle?
Yep. Yep. Money is always an issue for
Yeah,
sure.
money talks. It's the truth.
Yep. All right, David. I want to play a little game with you.
All right.
So with so with any of our alternative fuels, there are always these myths, are always these false narratives that people conjure up just to give propane, CNG, EVs a bad name. So what I
Mhm.
want to do is I've come up with a couple of statements that I've heard about propane, and I want you to tell me what the myth surrounding that particular question is. So the first
Okay.
one, does
Okay,
it,
hit me.
yeah, does that make sense?
Go for it.
All right. So propane isn't safe for the environment.
Uh, Propane is non-toxic. If propane is spilled, it evaporates, and there is essentially not much of anything that you have to do in the event of a spill or an incident involving propane.
All right. You talked earlier about where propane comes from. So is
Mhm.
propane a clean and renewable energy?
It can be. If you're talking about conventional propane, it's still a hydrocarbon. It's still produced through the oil and gas drilling and refining process. There's going to be associated pollution with that process, and conventional propane itself is a petroleum fuel. It's a petroleum-based form of source of energy. However, and again, this is one of these another one of these changes that has really taken place just in the last 4, 5, 6 years. There is now renewable propane. You've probably heard of biodiesel. Biodiesel can be produced from used cooking oil. It can be produced from animal fats, grease, tallow, substances like that. And you can do the same thing with propane. The process, and this is what's called renewable propane. I'm sorry, let me back up here in a second. There's
Mhm.
biodiesel and there is renewable biodiesel. There's propane and there's also renewable propane. Both renewable biodiesel and, more to the point, renewable propane are refined, are developed from renewable sources. The cooking oil and grease and tallow and lard and stuff like that that I mentioned before. So you're not taking that out of the ground. It is not associated with oil and gas formations. It's a renewable form of propane that can be produced from what would otherwise be a waste stream. So instead of dumping grease down the trap or into the rivers, you are converting it into fuel.
I actually did not know that there was renewable propane. I guess I should have, but I mean the renewable everything is coming online at this point, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was propane as well. How long
It's
has
pretty
renewable
it's pretty new. It's a
yeah,
pretty new process. This is only just really now starting to scale up.
yeah. That I mean that makes a lot more sense. But it's good for all of our viewers or listeners to hear about that there is a renewable way of creating propane.
Mhm.
All right, so the next myth, propane causes air pollution.
If you are going to be using, in most cases, hydrocarbon-based fuel, it's much, much cleaner than conventional, particularly conventional diesel. And I'm mentioning diesel because propane in most cases is used as a substitute for diesel. Uh, 36% lower nitrogen oxide emissions compared to diesel, 70% less sulfur dioxide emissions compared to even electric vehicles, and that's counting their full life cycle. 45% reductions in particulate matter, lower carbon content than gas and diesel. It is substantially cleaner than either diesel or gasoline.
And then finally, you talked a little bit about fueling. Why would I go to propane if it's a pain if it's a pain for propane to fuel, why would I use it?
Well, it's not nearly as much of a pain as it used to be. There's going to be a little bit of variability on this because some propane providers are going to be using the old equipment, but for a lot of dealers and suppliers, and particularly for fleet applications, the gasoline style dispenser nozzle is very quickly becoming the energy standard. It takes a little getting used to, but it's really not that different. If you can plug in an electric car, you can probably handle a current generation propane nozzle.
Well, that's certainly good to know. I'm glad it's a little bit easier now than it used to be. I don't even want to know what it was like back in the past, but
Oh, yeah, it was big and clumsy and complicated, but that is changing rapidly.
that's great. I think that's going to be all for my myths portion of this. So I appreciate you answering those
Mhm.
questions. I think that gives a much clearer vision of what propane is all about. Now let's go to more like practicalities. So
Mhm.
if a company was considering propane, what should they do? What's their first line of objectives?
Well, for companies, organizations, school districts, local governments, whoever it might be, who is thinking about making this kind of a transition, you're probably going to start with dollars and cents because that is the way these things pretty much have to happen. First of all, there are a couple of good sites you can go to calculate vehicle costs. So you can go, for instance, to afdc.energy.gov. That's the Alternative Fuels Data Center. And they have a couple of pretty solid calculators that are going to give you estimates on the potential savings, likely costs, upfront conversion expenses you're going to be taking on that are going to be involved in that. And one thing that I kind of neglected to mention here, that the other reason that propane is increasingly popular is that it's cheap. We are looking right now, and this is speaking just regionally for the Kansas City area, we're looking at regular gasoline around 290, 295. We're looking at diesel 310, 320 per gallon. Propane pricing, uh, I guess it's currently somewhere around $1.40 to $1.60 for a gallon. And if you have a contract with a propane supplier, it can be substantially cheaper than that. So the driver for fleets and organizations thinking about converting is the fact that you are going to be saving a lot of money on fuel over time.
Yep.
So
So even if you do have a decrease in uh, energy reduction, that 73% I think that you talked about, the energy density of gasoline, it's still going to be more. It's still going to be made up more in the total price whenever it's about half the amount of money for a gallon.
yeah, and there are other advantages as well in that diesel engines today are a lot cleaner than they used to be. But they've gotten that way through this increasingly Byzantine series of particulate filters and diesel emissions fluids. And to really work, the vehicle has to run up at a certain temperature and a certain speed for a certain amount of time in order for the system to get hot enough to really effectively uh, handle the particulates and emissions that work off diesel. With propane, you don't have those issues. There's no particulate filters, there's no emissions fluid, there's none of that. And that's simply going from the fuel that is cleaner from the get-go. So there's cost savings there as well in terms of maintenance and parts and replacements and all of that. So money, dollars and cents. There's other things that people need to think about. You may need modifications for a fueling site if you're running a fleet. Excuse me, not quite over that cold. If you are running a fleet, you may need to modify your garage. That's a possibility. Since propane is heavier than air, if there's a leak, if there's a line that gets loose, something goes wrong during servicing, that propane is going to sink to the lowest point it can find. So if you have, for example, a service pit where the vehicle pulls in and the mechanic goes down underneath to work on it, that's where that propane is going to end up. You will probably need to set up training for your mechanics, for your drivers, on how to fuel the vehicles, on servicing, on how propane works differently from diesel or gasoline. You'll need to look at how you're going to handle fueling. Do you want to do it on site? Do you want your propane provider to come and do it with a truck? That's fixed versus mobile fueling. You'll want to confirm your costs per gallon with your propane supplier. It could be Ferrogas or any number of companies like that who provide propane. That's typically done on a contract basis. And finally, check and see what incentives are out there because they do exist. This is just within Missouri. So if you're listening and you live in Kansas and thinking about this, my apologies. There's an organization, the Missouri Propane Education and Research Council, and they are currently offering $2,000 cash for a new propane bus replacing an old diesel bus. And that's up to 10 buses per Missouri school district. The funding is still there. It's not there forever. So you'll want to check that out. You can find them at propanemissouri.com. There are incentives in other states. There are incentives for vehicle conversions. There are, again, AFDC has a wonderful list of all the different alt fuel incentives that are out there. And you can find out more than you probably ever wanted to know about propane incentives because there is an industry, propane industry, and that industry is interested in getting more people using their product.
So now I think is as good a time as any to say, David just went down a list of a few items that need to do, and it might seem overwhelming to you if you are considering going to propane. But I would like to say that if you ever are considering propane as a fuel of choice for your fleet, contact us. Contact Kansas City Clean Cities. We will help you all along the way. That vehicle cost calculator that's on AFDC, we would be happy to go with it through you. We'd be happy to take your numbers from your data and plug those in to see what kind of savings that you can get. We would love to do targeted analysis. Maybe we can find some of those incentives that David was talking about with MOPERC. It might not just be through Missouri, but we can find some national incentives as well, maybe some state grants. And we can do that. We can do the heavy lifting there if you are considering it all. So that if you are considering it all going to propane, because we want you to get off of diesel and gasoline. That is our main goal here, and this is why we're going through this with you. So if you do have, go ahead.
No, exactly. This is what we do. Metroenergy.org. Come and find us, and we can help.
Absolutely. So I think we're going to conclude this all with you've been in Kansas City for a while now. You've worked with some fleets that have gone to propane. Can you give an experience, maybe just one, of how a fleet did with propane, and some of maybe the challenges and the overall benefits?
Yeah, sure. We've got a local school district here. They run a total of about 40, 42, 43 buses. And they have been working hard over the past 5 years to convert those buses from diesel to propane. They're about halfway there. I believe they have a total of 22 propane buses in their fleet. We helped them get some grant money early on from the U.S. Department of Energy to help set up their fueling infrastructure on site. That's at their fleet location. And it's been a popular move for their mechanics, for their drivers, for the parents, for kids. The buses are way quieter in addition to being cleaner. And there were some initial misgivings in terms of, are you sure we can get fuel if we take this bus on the road? Hasn't been a problem. They were taking, I can't remember, it was either a band or a sports team over to, I believe, Columbia. And given that propane gives you fewer miles per gallon than gasoline or diesel, they were a bit concerned about that. But it turned out to be a non-issue. While the team was at their tournament, or the band was at their concert, whatever it was, the driver simply called a local propane supplier. He called from a travel center along I-70. They came over, topped off the bus, and he got home no problems whatsoever. There has been some time and money invested in getting mechanics and drivers trained, but on balance, they've been really happy with their experience, and they're looking to uh, go completely propane, probably within the next 3 to 5 years. So far, so good.
So David, what it sounds like is that we're not just trying to push a fuel to push a fuel. There is actually some real world applications that have already been successful in Kansas City. And forgive me if I'm wrong, but any sort of challenge that a fleet has come up with, you have been there every step of the way to overcome that problem and come up with a solution.
Well, I've helped as possible, and I've helped to the degree that I can. Obviously, I'm not going to be swapping out, replacing a cracked cylinder head because I don't have the expertise to do that. But if it's a question about funding, if it's a question about fuel efficiency, if it's a question about how do we make this work, then yeah, I've been delighted to help out.
Well, David, I appreciate you helping out with this podcast. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that we would very much like to have you on another podcast in the future, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you bet.
Awesome.
Give me enough time to sort of bone up on the fuel of the week, and I'll be happy to join you next time.
We can certainly do that. Well, next time we will be talking about biodiesel. We will be doing that right after the National Biodiesel Conference, which is the week of January, what, 17th, 18th,
Yeah,
something like
next
that.
week, live
Yeah.
in Vegas.
Yep. So, um, coming off of the biodiesel conference, we'll have Tammy back, and we will be discussing all the new things that the National Biodiesel Conference has to offer. So until then, we hope everyone has a great week, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening to MEC Live.